The Rise of Queen Victoria: How a Young Monarch Redefined an Empire. The rise of Queen Victoria marked a turning point, not just for the British monarchy, but for an entire empire at the height of global transformation. Ascending the throne in 1837 at the age of 18, Victoria inherited a nation brimming with industrial potential and political complexity. Despite her youth and initial inexperience, she quickly began to carve a distinct identity for herself and for the monarchy. Her reign began during a period when the institution of monarchy was being questioned. Yet she managed to reinvent its role and forge a connection with the public that had long been waning. Through her personal conduct and firm moral standing, she positioned herself as a symbol of stability and continuity in a rapidly changing world. Victoria's early reign was shaped significantly by her close relationship with Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, who became her trusted advisor and helped guide her through the intricacies of governance. She was not content to be a mere figurehead and took an active interest in state affairs. Her education had prepared her for public service, but it was her innate sense of duty and discipline that enabled her to shoulder the immense responsibilities of queenship. As her political acumen matured, so did her role as a constitutional monarch, balancing ceremonial duties with real influence behind the scenes. This blend of involvement and restraint was a hallmark of her reign, setting a precedent for future monarchs. The marriage between Queen Victoria and Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha further solidified her reign. Their partnership was not only deeply affectionate but also intellectually collaborative. Albert played a key role in advising Victoria, especially in areas of reform, science, and the arts. Under their joint patronage, Britain saw the flourishing of cultural institutions, the promotion of education, and the support of technological advancement. Albert's influence was particularly evident in the organization of the Great Exhibition of 1851, a showcase of British innovation and industrial might that cemented the empire's status as a global leader. Victoria's image evolved into one of a matriarch, both of her family and her realm. As the British Empire expanded its reach across continents, she became an emblem of imperial unity. Colonies and dominions viewed her not just as a distant monarch, but as a shared sovereign who symbolized order, justice, and continuity. Her role as Empress of India further underscored her symbolic presence in the farthest corners of the empire. This identification with empire did not diminish her domestic popularity. Rather, it enhanced it, intertwining national pride with her personal reputation. Throughout her reign, Queen Victoria navigated numerous personal and political challenges. The early death of Prince Albert in 1861 cast a long shadow over her life, plunging her into deep mourning and temporarily withdrawing her from public appearances. Yet even in grief, her stature did not wane. The public eventually welcomed her return to ceremonial life, and her resilience became part of her enduring legacy. As industrialization transformed cities and society, she remained a reassuring constant amid the upheaval, embodying values of propriety, perseverance, and duty. Under Victoria's rule, the monarchy transitioned from a once isolated institution into a central component of British identity. Her long reign witnessed vast changes, from the introduction of railways and telegraphs to the evolution of political parties and labour rights. She managed to adapt to these shifts without compromising the dignity of her office. By the time of her death in 1901, she had become not just a sovereign, but a unifying figure whose presence had defined an entire age. Her ability to evolve with the times, while maintaining the core principles of monarchy, left an indelible mark on history. The Victorian era, named in her honour, became synonymous with progress, propriety, and the power of transformation under the quiet strength of a young queen who grew to command an empire. Industrial revolution's boom, how Victorian innovation reshaped the world. The Industrial Revolution marked a transformative era in human history, and its most explosive phase occurred during the Victorian Age. This period, spanning the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, saw an unparalleled surge in technological advancement, urban expansion, and social restructuring. Britain became the epicenter of innovation, where steam power, mechanization, and novel engineering practices converged to reshape not only the nation's economy, but also the global order. Factories replaced cottage industries, and handcrafted methods gave way to machines that could operate at unprecedented speeds and scales, ushering in mass production across various sectors. One of the defining features of this transformation was the widespread adoption of steam engines, which powered trains, ships, and factories, enabling faster transportation and production. Railways stitched the country together, reducing travel time drastically and opening remote areas to commerce and industry. Iron and coal, abundant in Britain, became the backbone of industrial growth, fueling everything from locomotives to blast furnaces. These developments allowed goods to be moved efficiently, raw materials to be transported quickly, and markets to expand beyond local boundaries into international territories. The revolution in transport also led to the emergence of standardized time and scheduling, crucial for coordinating the movement of people and freight. Victorian innovation extended into communication, with the telegraph revolutionizing the way information traveled. Instant messaging over great distances became possible for the first time, altering diplomacy, journalism, and commerce. Factories employing hundreds, sometimes thousands, of workers became common, creating new forms of labor organization and management. Urban centers swelled as rural populations migrated to cities in search of employment, giving rise to sprawling metropolises with both opportunity and overcrowding. These cities bore witness to the stark contrasts of the era while industrialists accumulated immense wealth. Working-class families often lived in cramped and unsanitary conditions. The textile industry, among the earliest to be mechanized, saw remarkable advances. Innovations such as the spinning jenny, power loom, and cotton gin drastically increased output, reducing the cost of fabric and making clothing more accessible to broader segments of the population. British factories soon dominated global markets, exporting textiles across continents and establishing a powerful industrial empire. Meanwhile, advancements in metallurgy, particularly the Bessemer process, allowed for the mass production of steel, a critical material for constructing bridges, railways, and ships that connected the world as never before. Education and scientific inquiry also flourished during this time, partly driven by the needs of an industrial society. Technical colleges, engineering institutions, and scientific journals proliferated, contributing to a culture of innovation. Engineers and inventors like Isambard Kingdom Brunel and James Nasmyth became public figures celebrated for their feats of mechanical genius. Their works, railways, tunnels, and steamships stood as monuments to human ingenuity and ambition. These infrastructure projects not only improved daily life, but also symbolized national progress and modernity. Public health and sanitation gradually became a concern as urban populations grew denser. Although initially neglected, the outbreaks of diseases such as cholera led to reforms in sewage management and the establishment of cleaner water supplies. These efforts, though uneven, marked early steps toward the modern welfare state. Concurrently, labor movements began to demand better wages, safer working conditions, and reduced working hours, setting the stage for future social reforms. The Victorian era also saw the gradual expansion of suffrage, slowly incorporating broader sections of society into the democratic process, though full equality remained a distant goal. Internationally, the impact of Victorian industrialization was far-reaching. British technological prowess and economic might influenced global trade routes, colonial administration, and geopolitical strategy. The machinery and systems developed during this period were exported and imitated worldwide, spreading industrial practices across Europe, North America, and parts of Asia. The Victorian Industrial Revolution was not merely a phase of economic development, it redefined the relationship between humans and their environment, between labor and capital, and between nations and the world economy. Its legacy continues to echo in the infrastructure, institutions, and industries that shape the modern age. Victorian class system. The origins of modern social stratification. The Victorian class system, which emerged and solidified during Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, played a crucial role in shaping the contours of modern social stratification. Rooted in centuries of feudalism and transformed by the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian era saw the rigid codification of class distinctions that still influence social structures today. Britain, during this time, underwent sweeping economic, technological, and demographic changes, prompting a recalibration of social identities and power dynamics. While the aristocracy maintained their dominance through land ownership and hereditary privilege, a new and increasingly powerful middle class began to emerge, driven by commerce, industry, and professional occupations. This shift redefined societal norms and expectations, solidifying a stratified model based on economic roles, education, and cultural values. At the top of the hierarchy stood the nobility and the landed gentry, whose wealth was largely inherited and often disconnected from the industrial engine driving Britain's growth. They wielded influence in Parliament, owned vast estates, and adhered to long-standing traditions that underscored their social superiority. Their position was reinforced by a deep-rooted belief in natural order and lineage, which found expression in institutions such as elite schools and exclusive clubs. Beneath them, the middle class was rising rapidly. Composed of factory owners, bankers, doctors, and lawyers, this group gained prestige and political influence as the economy shifted from agrarian roots to industrial might. Their success was typically based on merit, education, and enterprise, reflecting a growing societal value placed on personal achievement and self-discipline. The lower middle class and skilled working class formed a buffer zone in this structure, often aspiring to the values and lifestyle of their social superiors. Clerks, teachers, shopkeepers, and artisans found themselves in a complex web of ambition and restraint, striving for upward mobility through thrift, education, and moral conduct. The ideal of respectability became central, with behaviors like punctuality, sobriety, and proper speech distinguishing them from the lower classes. Meanwhile, the working class, which constituted the majority of the population, labored in factories, mines, and domestic service, often under harsh and exploitative conditions. Their lives were marked by long hours, low wages, and minimal access to education or health care. Yet they too were subject to social expectations and divisions based on skill, stability, and conduct. Beneath all these layers were the so-called underclass, a term not widely used at the time, but retrospectively applied, to describe the destitute and unemployed. This group often lived in slums or workhouses, their existence precarious and stigmatized. They were sometimes portrayed in literature and public discourse as morally deficient or lazy, a view that helped justify their exclusion from reforms and social protections. Yet many among them were victims of industrial displacement, economic downturns, or ill health. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 institutionalized their marginalization, pushing them into workhouses where conditions were intentionally harsh to discourage reliance on public assistance. This stratified order was not simply economic, it was also deeply cultural. Speech, clothing, manners, and leisure activities all served to signal one's class position. Access to education was a key dividing line, with elite institutions shaping future leaders, while limited schooling options for the working class often curtailed their prospects. Religion, too, played a role, with certain denominations and practices aligning more closely with specific classes. Women's roles were also profoundly affected by class, as upper-class women were expected to focus on domestic refinement, middle-class women on moral guardianship, and working-class women on wage labour. By the end of the Victorian period, social mobility had increased slightly, yet the boundaries remained largely intact. The values, norms, and structures established during this era laid the groundwork for the class systems that followed, influencing how societies perceive hierarchy, opportunity, and inequality even into the modern age. The Victorian class system, then, was not just a historical phenomenon, but a foundational blueprint for contemporary social stratification. The British Empire's expansion, colonies, commerce, and control. The expansion of the British Empire stands as one of the most significant episodes in world history, marked by a complex interplay of colonization, economic ambition, and strategic dominance. Spanning centuries, but reaching its height during the 19th and early 20th centuries, the empire extended British influence across every continent, except Antarctica. This vast territorial reach was not merely the result of military strength, but also a deliberate policy of securing overseas possessions to control resources, trade routes, and political influence. As Britain transitioned from a maritime kingdom into a global power, its expansion reflected both the ambitions of the ruling class and the broader cultural belief in the superiority of British civilization. The drive for colonies began with exploration and maritime enterprise, eventually giving way to formal occupation and governance. Trading companies, most notably the British East India Company, played an early role in this process, initially acting as commercial agents before evolving into instruments of imperial authority. Through trade and negotiation, and later through military conquest, they established footholds in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. These outposts became centers of administration and commerce, anchoring Britain's global network. Strategic locations such as Gibraltar, Singapore, and the Suez Canal became vital to protecting British interests and ensuring naval supremacy. Economic motivations were central to the imperial project, with colonies providing raw materials such as cotton, tea, sugar, rubber, and precious metals that fueled Britain's industrial growth. These goods were extracted and exported to British markets, while manufactured products flowed in the opposite direction, creating a cycle of economic dependency. Colonies also served as destinations for surplus capital and labor, absorbing migration and investment. The integration of colonial economies into global trade systems allowed Britain to maintain its commercial dominance, often at the expense of local industries and traditional livelihoods. Control over territories also brought political leverage on the global stage. By the late 19th century, Britain's imperial holdings were so extensive that it was said the sun never set on the British Empire. This reach afforded unparalleled influence in diplomatic and military affairs, enabling Britain to shape international relations and enforce its interests abroad. In times of conflict, the empire provided not only resources, but also manpower, as colonial troops were mobilized in both world wars to support British campaigns. These contributions further highlighted the interconnected nature of the imperial system. Administration of such a vast empire required intricate governance structures, often blending direct rule with local intermediaries. In some regions, Britain imposed its own legal, educational, and political systems, aiming to replicate British models. In others, it co-opted traditional rulers and institutions to maintain order. This dual approach allowed Britain to exert control while minimizing resistance. However, it also created tensions between imposed authority and indigenous cultures, often leading to conflict, resistance movements, and eventual demands for independence. Cultural influence accompanied economic and political domination. British language, literature, education, and legal principles were promoted in the colonies, creating a shared framework that outlived colonial rule. Missionary activity aimed at spreading Christianity also played a role in cultural transformation, though it often disrupted established beliefs and practices. Education systems modelled on British curricula introduced new ideas but also served to entrench colonial hierarchies. These efforts, while sometimes beneficial in terms of infrastructure and literacy, often marginalized local traditions and languages. The expansion of the empire was not without its critics, even at the height of its power. Debates within Britain about the moral and economic costs of empire revealed a growing awareness of its complexities. Some saw the empire as a civilizing mission, while others viewed it as a system of exploitation. Colonial subjects themselves expressed a range of responses, from collaboration to resistance, eventually forming the basis of nationalist movements. These movements would grow in strength over the 20th century, challenging British authority and leading to decolonization. As the empire receded in the post-war period, its legacy remained deeply embedded in global politics, economics, and culture. Former colonies continued to grapple with borders, institutions, and identities shaped by imperial rule. Victorian morality and manners, birthplace of modern etiquette. Victorian morality and manners were not just a passing social trend, but a powerful force that helped shape the framework of modern etiquette. Emerging in Britain during the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901, this era was marked by a deep concern for propriety, decorum, and moral conduct. The values that dominated this time were rooted in ideals of self-discipline, respectability, and a rigid social hierarchy, which collectively influenced the everyday behaviors of individuals across all classes. These standards extended beyond personal life and deeply permeated public interaction, family structures, gender roles, and institutional conduct. The Victorian emphasis on manners was not merely a preference, but a necessity for social survival. People were judged by how they behaved in public, how they addressed others, and even how they dressed. Proper etiquette became a symbol of one's upbringing, education, and moral standing. Everything from dining habits to letter writing was bound by rules that signaled refinement and integrity. This moral rigidity was not without its complexities. It encouraged people to present a polished image, sometimes at the cost of personal freedom and emotional expression. Nevertheless, the commitment to refinement contributed to an era that held respect, humility, and civility in high regard. An elaborate system of social codes dictated interactions between men and women. Courtship, for instance, was laden with rituals and unspoken rules that emphasized restraint and propriety. Women were expected to be modest, soft-spoken, and deferential, while men were seen as protectors and providers, upholding ideals of honor and duty. Although these roles were often restrictive, they reflected a cultural effort to maintain stability and order in a rapidly changing society. Industrialization and urban growth had created new opportunities and challenges, and Victorian morality served as an anchor in this shifting landscape. Education and literature played crucial roles in reinforcing moral values during this time. Children were taught from an early age to exhibit good manners and to respect authority. Storybooks, school curricula, and household guides emphasized virtues like honesty, diligence, and charity. The idea of the ideal home gained prominence, where the family functioned as a moral unit led by a virtuous mother and a responsible father. This domestic ideal was projected as the foundation of a strong nation, reinforcing the belief that personal conduct had a direct impact on societal well-being. Public institutions such as churches and schools also propagated these values. Sermons, pamphlets, and educational materials underscored the importance of moral behavior as a civic duty. Philanthropy and charity became widespread, viewed not only as acts of kindness but as moral obligations. The era encouraged people to uplift others, though often through a lens of social superiority. Still, these efforts helped foster a sense of community and responsibility among citizens, encouraging cooperation and compassion within the confines of a class-conscious society. Interestingly, the Victorian period also witnessed the beginnings of reforms that would later challenge the very standards it upheld. Movements advocating for women's rights, better working conditions, and educational access began to gain traction. These developments indicated a growing awareness of the limitations within the moral and social structures of the time. Yet, even in the face of reform, the emphasis on politeness, consideration for others, and a sense of duty continued to hold sway. The Victorian legacy lay not in its rigidity alone, but in its sincere attempt to cultivate a society based on mutual respect and ethical conduct. Though much has changed since the Victorian era, its impact on modern etiquette is undeniable. Many of today's customs, from polite greetings and dress codes to formal correspondence and dinner table manners, have their roots in this time. The detailed attention to interpersonal behavior, the prioritization of respect, and the belief that character is reflected in conduct are enduring principles that continue to guide social interactions. Victorian morality and manners, for all their intricacies and contradictions, laid a foundation that remains relevant in promoting civility and dignity in human relations today. The invention of modern childhood. Why kids today live differently. Childhood, as we understand it today, is a relatively modern concept, shaped by centuries of cultural, economic, and social transformation. For much of human history, children were seen not as a separate group with unique needs, but as miniature adults expected to contribute to the household as soon as they were able. In agrarian societies, work was essential for survival, and children labored alongside their parents from an early age, with little distinction between the world of play and the world of work. Education, where available, was a privilege, often reserved for the wealthy. For most families, teaching children practical skills mattered more than nurturing imagination or emotional well-being. The shift toward what we now consider modern childhood began with industrialization in the 18th and 19th centuries. As factories replaced farms and cities expanded, children were often employed in dangerous labor, sparking public concern and eventually leading to child labor laws. These reforms laid the groundwork for recognizing childhood as a distinct and protected phase of life. Alongside legal changes, the rise of public education systems in many countries created new spaces and roles for children, extending the time before they entered the adult workforce and reinforcing the idea that childhood should be a time for learning and growth, not toil. As societies became more affluent, attitudes toward children evolved further. By the mid-20th century, in many parts of the world, especially in the West, children were increasingly viewed not as economic contributors, but as individuals to be nurtured, educated, and prepared for the future. This period saw a dramatic expansion of the toy industry, children's media, and child-focused marketing, reflecting the growing cultural and economic significance of youth. Childhood began to be seen as a golden time of innocence and joy, and protecting that experience became a collective societal goal. Technological advancements played a pivotal role in reshaping the experience of childhood. The invention of the radio, followed by television and later the internet, introduced children to vast new worlds of information and entertainment. Each generation of media brought with it concerns and optimism about how it would affect young minds. By the early 21st century, smartphones and social media transformed not just how children learned and communicated, but also how they perceived themselves and their place in the world. Digital life blurred the lines between childhood and adolescence, bringing new challenges around identity, safety, and mental health. Parenting styles have also evolved in response to shifting societal expectations. Where earlier generations often emphasized discipline and obedience, today's parenting is more likely to focus on emotional support, personal development, and psychological well-being. This transformation is reflected in how parents involve themselves in education, extracurricular activities, and the management of screen time. While some argue that children today are overprotected or overly scheduled, others view these changes as necessary adaptations to a more complex and demanding world. Education has undergone significant changes as well. Once limited to basic literacy and numeracy, curricula now emphasize critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration. Children today are expected to acquire digital skills, global awareness, and adaptability traits, essential in a fast-changing world. The role of the teacher has shifted from that of an authority figure to a guide or facilitator, encouraging students to discover knowledge for themselves. Learning environments are increasingly designed to support individual needs, recognizing that no two children learn the same way. Another factor in the reinvention of childhood is the changing structure of families. Smaller family sizes, increased urbanization, and dual-income households have led to different dynamics at home. With fewer siblings and more individual attention, many children today grow up in environments where their opinions are valued and their feelings considered. This has empowered young people in unprecedented ways, allowing them to participate in conversations about climate change, social justice, and equality from a young age. In all these ways, modern childhood is a product of layered historical shifts, each building upon the last. It reflects not only advances in science, education, and technology, but also a deeper philosophical transformation in how society understands human development. The experience of being a child today is distinct from any previous era, not better or worse, but different in ways that continue to evolve with the world around us. Railways, telegraphs, and time. Victorian tech that changed how we connect. In the heart of the 19th century, a series of revolutionary technologies emerged that fundamentally altered how people perceived distance, communication, and time itself. Chief among these innovations were the railways and telegraphs, which together ushered in a new age of connection during the Victorian era. These advancements didn't merely change the mechanics of travel or messaging, they reshaped the very structure of society, influencing commerce, governance, and the human sense of geography. Before railways, travel was slow and arduous, dictated by the rhythm of horses and the conditions of primitive roads. The arrival of steam locomotion transformed this reality. Trains could move people and goods at unprecedented speeds, linking towns and cities that once seemed distant. What had taken days now took mere hours. The expansion of the railway network enabled regional economies to thrive, as products could reach markets quickly and efficiently. London became a hub not only of politics and culture, but also of transportation. Its rail termini radiating like spokes from the capital. For the first time, a unified sense of national identity began to take hold, bound together by iron rails that crossed the country. With speed came the need for coordination. Prior to the railway boom, local time was set by the position of the sun, meaning that noon in Bristol might differ from noon in London by several minutes. Such discrepancies were harmless in a slower world, but they proved disastrous for train schedules. The railway companies soon adopted a standardized time Greenwich Mean Tomato, maintained consistency and safety. This act of synchronizing clocks across regions marked one of the earliest instances of centralized temporal control. It compelled people to think beyond their local environment, adjusting to a shared, mechanical understanding of time that was dictated not by nature, but by human design. Simultaneously, the telegraph arrived as a marvel of electrical ingenuity. Messages that once travelled by foot, horse, or ship could now be transmitted in seconds through a system of wires and pulses. It was the first technology to sever communication from transportation. No longer did a message require physical movement. It could leap across the landscape on copper lines, reducing delays from days to moments. The electric telegraph revolutionized news reporting, enabling newspapers to carry updates that were hours old rather than weeks. Businesses, too, embraced it, using telegraphy to coordinate shipments, prices, and contracts across vast distances with astonishing speed. The impact of the telegraph extended beyond economics. Politically, it allowed governments to project authority and respond to crises with newfound swiftness. Diplomacy, once a slow and uncertain exchange, became more immediate and precise. For ordinary people, the notion of being able to send a message across the country in the blink of an eye was both magical and transformative. It connected friends and families separated by geography, creating emotional ties that defied physical distance. Together, railways and telegraphs forged a world that was more tightly knit, yet also more complex. The relentless pace introduced by these systems demanded new habits, disciplines, and expectations. Schedules became sacrosanct, delays intolerable, and information time-sensitive. These technologies imposed a rhythm on daily life that was governed by machinery and electricity rather than sunlight and seasons. People began to live by the clock, plan by the timetable, and think in terms of minutes rather than days. In this new reality, the very concept of space and time was reimagined. What once felt vast now seemed close. What had been slow was now fast. Victorian society underwent a profound psychological shift, moving from a world of isolated locales to a networked civilization. The railways and telegraphs didn't just span distances, they collapsed them, rendering England, and eventually the world, smaller in perception. These tools of connection laid the groundwork for the modern age, anticipating the global networks of the future with steel rails and electric wires. And in doing so, they not only transported people and messages, but carried an entire era into a new dimension of shared experience. Workhouses and welfare. The era that sparked the social safety net. The era of workhouses and the origins of the welfare state is one of the most pivotal chapters in modern social history. It marked a time when society began grappling earnestly with the moral, economic, and institutional responsibilities owed to its poorest and most vulnerable citizens. In the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had dramatically transformed the social fabric of Britain. Rapid urbanization, mechanized labor, and fluctuating employment levels left large segments of the population struggling for survival. Amidst this upheaval, the old systems of parish-based charity proved inadequate, leading to the emergence of the workhouse as a formalized institution under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. The aim was to deter dependency by making conditions within these facilities deliberately harsh, on the belief that only the truly desperate would submit themselves to such environments. Workhouses were places where those unable to support themselves could live and work in exchange for basic necessities. Men, women, and children were strictly segregated, and their daily lives were ruled by routine and discipline. Labor was often monotonous and physically demanding, such as stone breaking or oakum picking, and the food was intentionally meagre. The prevailing ideology was rooted in the Victorian values of self-reliance and moral character, and poverty was often interpreted as a personal failing rather than a structural issue. This judgmental lens informed much of the policy and public opinion at the time, casting the poor in a negative light that shaped how assistance was offered. Despite the austere conditions, the workhouse system represented a significant departure from earlier, more informal forms of aid. It brought a level of administrative structure and nationwide policy consistency, which, however flawed, laid the groundwork for future reform. The increasing visibility of hardship and the documented cruelties within these institutions began to provoke public criticism and a broader conversation around human dignity and social responsibility. Campaigners, religious leaders, writers, and even medical professionals began speaking out against the system, highlighting its failings and pushing for a more humane approach. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the intellectual climate began to shift. The rise of social liberalism, new economic theories, and growing labor movements began to reshape how society understood poverty. The notion that deprivation was often beyond an individual's control gained more acceptance, leading to an emphasis on preventative measures rather than punitive ones. The idea that a civilized society should guarantee a minimum standard of living started to gain traction, fueled by empirical studies into living conditions, health, and the effects of poverty on children and families. The workhouse system gradually began to wane as new forms of public assistance emerged. The introduction of old age pensions in 1908, followed by the National Insurance Act of 1911, signaled a philosophical shift from punitive deterrence to protective support. These developments were driven not only by moral concerns, but also by pragmatic considerations about national strength, economic productivity, and social stability. Governments began to see social welfare not as charity, but as an investment in the nation's future. The First World War further accelerated these changes, as the shared sacrifices of the war effort made stark inequalities harder to justify. By the time of the Second World War, the flaws of the old system were widely acknowledged. In 1942, the Beveridge Report laid the foundation for a comprehensive welfare state, proposing a system designed to combat the five giants of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. This report directly influenced the establishment of the National Health Service and various social insurance programs in post-war Britain. The workhouse, once a symbol of society's indifference, had by then been consigned to history, its legacy serving as a reminder of what happens when policy prioritizes deterrence over compassion. The era that began with punitive poor relief had, through slow but steady reform, transformed into one characterized by a collective commitment to human dignity and social care. Women in the Victorian era. Restriction, rebellion, and reform. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901 under the reign of Queen Victoria, was a time of immense social, political, and cultural transformation in Britain. Despite being ruled by a queen, the age was marked by rigid gender roles that confined women largely to the domestic sphere. The ideal Victorian woman was expected to embody purity, piety, and submissiveness, devoting herself entirely to the roles of wife, mother, and moral guardian of the home. Education for women was limited and often focused on domestic skills, with few opportunities for intellectual or professional development. Marriage was not only expected, but seen as the ultimate goal for women. And once married, a woman's legal rights were largely absorbed by her husband under the doctrine of coverture. She had no control over her property, her earnings, or even custody of her children. Society dictated that women should remain silent in political and public affairs, a restriction that stifled their voices for decades. Middle and upper-class women were especially affected, as their reputations hinged on adhering to the codes of propriety and modesty. Lower-class women, meanwhile, often worked as servants or in factories under harsh conditions, yet were still subject to the same moral expectations. This sharp contrast between expectation and reality began to sow the seeds of discontent. As the century progressed, women increasingly began to question these imposed roles and seek avenues for autonomy. The development of literature, journalism, and other forms of print culture provided a platform for women to express their thoughts and critique the structures that constrained them. Writers like Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot used fiction to subtly challenge the norms, crafting complex female characters who wrestled with societal expectations and personal desires. Their works opened windows into the struggles of women and hinted at the possibility of change. Meanwhile, reformers and activists began pushing for tangible improvements in women's lives. Campaigns for better education, legal rights, and suffrage gained momentum through the latter half of the century. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 were landmark reforms, granting married women control over their earnings and property, and challenging the absolute authority once held by husbands. The rise of female-led philanthropic organizations further empowered women to step into public life under the banner of charity, allowing them to navigate social boundaries without overtly challenging them. These efforts, though grounded in traditional values, gradually expanded the accepted roles of women and introduced a new sense of agency. Education reform also gained traction, with institutions like Girton College and Newnham College offering higher education to women for the first time. These advancements enabled a generation of educated women to enter professions like teaching, nursing, and social work, which were beginning to be seen as respectable pursuits. Simultaneously, the suffrage movement emerged as a powerful voice for political equality. Early suffragists worked tirelessly to organize petitions, public meetings, and written appeals advocating for women's right to vote. Although the right to vote would not be achieved during Queen Victoria's lifetime, the groundwork was laid by persistent and determined women who refused to accept silence as their fate. The contrast between the reverence for Queen Victoria herself and the lack of rights afforded to ordinary women was not lost on those calling for reform. Queen Victoria's own conservative views on gender ironically underscored the complex and often contradictory nature of the era. While many women still faced tremendous societal pressure to conform, the Victorian period also witnessed the birth of a collective female voice, uniting in quiet rebellion and visible reform. By the close of the 19th century, the seeds of change had firmly taken root, and the foundations for future advances in women's rights were well in place. The era's legacy is not merely one of restriction, but also of the courage, resilience, and vision that began to redefine womanhood for the modern age. The Gothic Revival, architecture that still haunts our streets. The Gothic Revival was more than just a return to pointed arches and ribbed vaults. It was a dramatic reawakening of medieval imagination in an age of industry and progress. Emerging in the late 18th century and flourishing through the 19th, this architectural movement grew out of a nostalgic admiration for the grandeur and mystique of Gothic cathedrals that had long dominated the skylines of medieval Europe. In the face of growing industrialization, many architects and patrons sought a spiritual and artistic counterbalance, turning to the past for inspiration. The resulting structures, both ecclesiastical and secular, were anything but replicas. They were emotionally charged, symbolically rich, and technically ambitious, a blend of romantic idealism and architectural prowess that still lingers in the bones of our cities. The influence of the Gothic Revival spread rapidly across Europe and into North America, infusing both urban and rural landscapes with its distinctive verticality and ornate detailing. From churches crowned with spires to ivy-clad universities and private mansions adorned with lancet windows, the style conveyed an air of solemnity, dignity, and rooted tradition. Its aesthetic borrowed heavily from medieval forms, but reinterpreted them through the lens of Victorian sensibility and technological advancement. Structures were no longer bound by the limitations of the Middle Ages. Iron frameworks allowed for taller towers, while mass-produced decorative elements gave rise to an architectural language that felt both ancient and modern. One of the most compelling features of the Gothic Revival is its deliberate attempt to connect architecture with emotion and meaning. The buildings were not merely shelters or institutions, they were visual sermons rendered in stone and wood, each line and carving charged with symbolism. Pointed arches drew the eye heavenward, while tracery windows filtered light into sacred patterns. Stained glass served as both ornamentation and narrative, weaving biblical and moral stories into the very walls of churches and halls. This attention to symbolism created spaces that inspired awe, inviting contemplation and reverence even in civic or educational settings. The movement's appeal was also deeply nationalistic. In Britain, figures like Augustus Pugin championed the Gothic style as a true expression of Christian and moral values. He believed that architecture could shape society, and that returning to the purity of medieval design would lead to a more virtuous and spiritually aware populace. His work on the interiors of the Palace of Westminster exemplified this philosophia monument to governance framed in architectural language, steeped in history, faith, and cultural pride. Across the Atlantic, architects like Richard Upjohn translated these ideals into American soil, designing churches and public buildings that echoed European grandeur while asserting a distinctly American identity. As the 19th century wore on, the Gothic revival diversified and adapted. Some structures embraced the high Victorian Gothic style, exploding with colour, texture, and eclecticism. Others took on a more academic and restrained form, particularly in university campuses that sought to align scholarship with medieval scholasticism. Despite these variations, the common thread remained: an enduring belief in the power of architecture to elevate the human spirit and reflect cultural ideals. Even graveyards were not spared the Gothic touch, as ornate mausoleums and arched gateways transformed spaces of mourning into realms of transcendence. Though the movement eventually waned in the face of modernist ideals, its legacy continues to cast long shadows. Many of its buildings still function today, their spires piercing the sky, their buttresses supporting both stone and story. They remind us of a time when architecture was not just about function, but about meaning, when every detail was a dialogue between the past and present. In modern cities, these structures often stand as quiet outliers amid steel and glass, whispering tales of chivalry, sanctity, and craftsmanship. They haunt our streets not as ghosts of obsolescence, but as monuments to a vision that dared to dream beyond utility. The Gothic revival may have looked backward for inspiration, but it built forward with passion, leaving behind an architectural legacy that remains as stirring as it is enduring. Victorian literature, stories that still shape pop culture today. Victorian literature, born in the period of Queen Victoria's reign from 1837 to 1901, remains a cornerstone of modern storytelling, influencing today's pop culture in subtle yet profound ways. Writers of the era crafted narratives that were both reflective of their time and strikingly ahead of it. They explored class divisions, industrialization, morality, gender roles, and the tension between science and religion, giving voice to the anxieties and aspirations of a rapidly changing society. The depth of character development and the complexity of plots in Victorian novels laid the groundwork for modern drama, television series, and film adaptations that still captivate audiences worldwide. The imaginative worlds created by authors such as Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy, and Oscar Wilde continue to shape storytelling conventions. Dickens, with his vivid portrayal of social inequality and deeply human characters, inspired countless adaptations, from gritty dramas to animated features. His character archetypes, the miserly Scrooge, the innocent orphan Oliver Twist, and the devoted yet downtrodden Bob Cratchit, live on in modern cinema and literature. These archetypes are frequently reimagined to reflect contemporary concerns, proving the enduring relevance of Dickens's social critique and narrative brilliance. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre introduced a new kind of heroine, intelligent, morally strong, and fiercely independent. Her journey from hardship to self-realization is echoed in today's most compelling female leads. The emotional depth and internal conflict portrayed in the novel helped pioneer the psychological realism now standard in both literature and screenwriting. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, on the other hand, broke boundaries with its dark, passionate themes and non-linear structure, anticipating modern narratives that explore flawed characters and unconventional love stories. The moral ambiguities and introspective qualities found in the work of Thomas Hardy, especially in novels like Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure, challenged the Victorian era's rigid moral codes. Today, such themes resonate in shows and films that grapple with societal judgment and personal redemption. Hardy's unflinching look at human suffering and social injustice remains deeply moving, reminding modern audiences of the lasting power of literature to confront uncomfortable truths. Oscar Wilde's sharp wit and satirical edge, most famously embodied in The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Importance of Being Earnest, have ensured his place in pop culture's literary pantheon. Wilde's commentary on vanity, superficiality, and the double lives, often led in polite society, mirrors the dualities portrayed in contemporary media. His memorable one-liners and flamboyant style have influenced generations of playwrights, comedians, and screenwriters, lending a timeless elegance and cleverness to modern dialogue. Beyond individual characters and plots, the narrative techniques honed by Victorian writers laid a foundation for serialized storytelling that is now a hallmark of television. Cliffhangers, detailed character arcs, and intricate plots that span multiple installments were refined in the serialized publication of novels during the Victorian Age. This format allowed for immersive storytelling and built anticipation among readers and experience, now mirrored by binge-worthy streaming content and multi-season series. Themes of identity, repression, and transformation found in Victorian Gothic literature have seeped into modern fantasy and horror genres. The duality of human nature explored in Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde continues to inspire adaptations and reinterpretations in science fiction and superhero narratives. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, though predating Victoria's reign, gained popularity in the Victorian period and influenced the era's literary landscape. Its exploration of creation, responsibility, and otherness echoes in modern media that tackles ethical dilemmas surrounding technology and humanity. Moreover, the Victorian novel's attention to social issues, child labour, women's rights, mental health, and poverty anticipated the socially conscious storytelling that defines much of today's literature and film. The emotional complexity and societal critique found in these works continue to offer valuable insights into the human condition, reminding contemporary audiences that stories from the past remain strikingly relevant. Victorian literature not only reflects its time, but also continues to evolve, inspiring creators across mediums to ask deeper questions and tell more resonant stories. Public health and sanitation, the start of urban cleanliness and medicine. Public health and sanitation marked a transformative era in human civilization, signaling the beginning of urban cleanliness and the organized practice of medicine. In early societies, health was primarily an individual or familial concern, often addressed through traditional remedies, spiritual beliefs, and rudimentary hygiene practices. However, with the rise of cities and denser populations, it became increasingly clear that disease was not merely a personal issue but a public one, requiring communal efforts and systemic organization. This realization laid the groundwork for the first public health initiatives, shaped by necessity and evolving understanding. Ancient civilizations like those in the Indus Valley demonstrated a surprisingly advanced grasp of sanitation. Archaeological discoveries reveal well-planned cities such as Mohenjo-Daro, equipped with covered drainage systems, public baths, and household latrines. These innovations reflected a community-wide awareness of hygiene's role in maintaining well-being, though the underlying mechanisms of disease were not yet understood. Similarly, the Romans constructed extensive aqueducts, sewers, and public toilets, ensuring access to clean water and the removal of waste. These infrastructural achievements not only improved daily living conditions but also became a foundation for future public health models. Despite these early efforts, the Middle Ages saw a decline in urban sanitation across Europe. Overcrowded cities, limited water supplies, and a lack of waste management led to frequent outbreaks of diseases such as the plague. These epidemics underscored the need for collective health strategies and encouraged civic leaders to revisit ancient practices while developing new ones. Gradually, measures like quarantine, public waste disposal, and the designation of officials to oversee urban cleanliness were introduced. Although primitive by modern standards, these steps were crucial in transitioning public health from concept to structured practice. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in science and observation, influencing medical knowledge and urban planning alike. The rediscovery of classical texts, paired with empirical studies, allowed scholars and physicians to better understand the links between environment and disease. This intellectual revival laid the foundation for the Enlightenment, a period marked by increased attention to rational thought and systemic reform. During this time, city governments began to take greater responsibility for the health of their citizens. Regulations for waste disposal, clean water provision, and pest control were slowly standardized, reflecting an evolving sense of civic duty and a growing comprehension of disease prevention. The Industrial Revolution, while ushering in unprecedented urban growth and technological advancement, also exposed the dire need for improved public health systems. Factories attracted masses to cities, resulting in overcrowded living quarters with poor ventilation, contaminated water, and unsanitary streets. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis highlighted the consequences of neglecting urban hygiene. Reformers and medical professionals began to advocate for organized sanitation systems, leading to the establishment of boards of health and the development of modern sewage and water treatment infrastructures. These reforms were often driven by both humanitarian concern and the economic imperative to maintain a healthy workforce. Scientific breakthroughs in the 19th century, particularly the germ theory proposed by Louis Pasteur and validated by Robert Koch, revolutionized medicine and public health. For the first time, diseases could be traced to specific microorganisms, leading to targeted interventions and a clearer rationale for sanitation measures. Vaccination campaigns, disinfection procedures, and sterile medical practices became standard. These developments reshaped the understanding of disease transmission and reinforced the value of cleanliness, not just in homes, but across entire cities. Governments began to play a more active role in health management, passing laws to ensure safe housing, regulate food quality, and control infectious diseases. The field of epidemiology emerged, offering a systematic approach to tracking illness and evaluating health outcomes. Public health became institutionalized, with universities offering specialized training and hospitals becoming centers for both treatment and research. Sanitation ceased to be merely about comfort or aesthetics. It became a critical component of modern governance and urban life. As cities expanded and populations grew, the principles of public health and sanitation continued to evolve. Technological innovations, from underground sewage networks to water filtration plants, became standard features of urban planning. Education reforms, how Victorian schools influenced today's classrooms. Education reforms during the Victorian era laid the foundation for many elements found in today's classrooms, transforming schooling from a privilege of the few into a societal expectation for all children. Before the 19th century, education in Britain was largely informal and unregulated, often provided by churches or charitable organizations with limited reach. The sweeping changes brought by the Industrial Revolution highlighted the need for a literate and skilled population, prompting government involvement in education and the eventual establishment of a national system. One of the most pivotal steps in this transformation was the Elementary Education Act of 1870, which created a framework for state involvement in primary schooling. This act allowed the formation of local school boards that were responsible for building and managing schools where existing provisions were insufficient. While the education provided was not free at first, the act marked a commitment to structured, secular education. This model emphasized the importance of literacy, numeracy, and moral development, reflecting the growing belief that education was essential for personal improvement and social order. As legislation evolved, compulsory attendance became central to educational policy. By the 1880s, laws were passed requiring children to attend school up to a certain age, reinforcing the idea that basic education was not optional. This shift had far-reaching consequences, gradually reducing child labor and emphasizing that schooling was a fundamental right and responsibility. Attendance rules laid the groundwork for the fixed academic calendar and daily schedules still seen in modern schools. The Victorian era also introduced a formalized curriculum, ensuring that students across different regions received a consistent education. Core subjects included reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and religious instruction. Lessons were heavily focused on repetition and memorization, designed to instill both knowledge and discipline. Though such teaching methods might now seem outdated, they established the first broadly consistent framework for evaluating student learning and academic achievement. Classroom discipline was strict, and the teacher's authority was rarely questioned. Teachers maintained order through firm control, and corporal punishment was a common form of correction. While this approach has been replaced by more compassionate discipline policies today, the expectation for orderly behavior and respect for authority can trace its roots to this period. Victorian classrooms functioned as places not only of academic learning but also of moral guidance and social training. Teacher training during this era began to receive institutional attention. The belief that effective education required skilled instruction led to the development of teacher training colleges. These institutions provided formal instruction in pedagogy, classroom management, and subject knowledge, thus enhancing the status of teaching as a profession. The notion that teachers should be trained, qualified, and continuously improving remains a core principle in modern education systems. Architectural design also reflected educational priorities. Victorian schools were often large, orderly buildings with multiple rooms dedicated to specific age groups. The layout typically involved rows of desks facing a blackboard, promoting a teacher-centered approach to instruction. Features like high windows, ventilation systems, and structured playgrounds underscored the importance of health and order. These early design choices influenced school construction for decades, creating a recognizable template for educational spaces. Monitoring and assessment practices began to emerge during this period. with school inspectors evaluating the performance of students, teachers, and institutions. These assessments were initially linked to government funding, incentivizing schools to meet certain standards. Although methods have evolved, the concept of educational accountability remains deeply embedded in how schools operate and are evaluated today. Victorian reforms also promoted the idea that education served a broader public purpose. Policymakers began to view schooling as essential to national progress, civic participation, and economic stability. The emphasis on moral values, citizenship, and shared national identity continues to influence contemporary curricula across various nations. Ultimately, the Victorian era redefined the role of schools, shaping a system that valued structure, accessibility, professionalism, and social responsibility. While today's classrooms have adapted to modern needs, many foundational aspects still reflect the profound and lasting influence of Victorian educational reforms: the science explosion, Darwin, discovery, and doubt. The 19th century witnessed a dramatic surge in scientific thought, often referred to as the science explosion, which profoundly reshaped how people understood the natural world. This period was marked by rapid advancements across disciplines such as biology, geology, chemistry, and astronomy. Among the most transformative figures of this era was Charles Darwin, whose theory of evolution by natural selection challenged traditional beliefs and ushered in a new age of inquiry and skepticism. Scientific discoveries did not unfold in isolation but emerged within a context of growing curiosity, improved technology, and increased exploration. As knowledge expanded, so too did questions that stirred intellectual debate and redefined humanity's place in the universe. Charles Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 was a pivotal moment that changed the course of scientific and philosophical thought. By proposing that species evolved over time through a process of natural selection, Darwin offered an explanation that relied on observation and evidence rather than static doctrines. His work built on the findings of earlier naturalists and geologists who had already begun to question the immutability of species and the age of the Earth. The idea that life forms could adapt and change based on environmental pressures introduced a dynamic view of nature, one that emphasized gradual transformation rather than sudden creation. This concept was revolutionary not only in its scientific implications, but also in how it encouraged people to think critically about accepted truths. The broader scientific community responded to Darwin's ideas with a mix of support, curiosity, and caution. Some embraced his theory as a brilliant synthesis of natural observations, while others feared it undermined long-standing interpretations of life's origin. However, the theory of evolution found reinforcement in discoveries such as fossil records, embryology, and comparative anatomy, which demonstrated patterns and similarities across different species. These findings helped solidify evolution as a credible scientific framework, though it continued to provoke debate and demand further investigation. It was not merely a challenge to established thought, but a catalyst that inspired new research in multiple directions. Simultaneously, geology experienced its own revolution. Scientists like Charles Lyell argued that the Earth's features had been shaped over immense periods by slow, natural processes. This notion of deep time provided the temporal scale necessary for evolution to occur and challenged previous views that the planet was only a few thousand years old. The layering of rock strata, the presence of marine fossils in mountainous regions, and the formation of canyons and valleys all pointed to a dynamic Earth shaped by erosion, sedimentation, and volcanic activity over millions of years. This understanding redefined humanity's relationship to the planet and placed our species within a vast and ancient context. In chemistry and physics, the 19th century saw the classification of elements and the identification of atomic structures, laying the groundwork for modern science. Advances in spectroscopy, thermodynamics, and electromagnetism expanded the boundaries of knowledge and fostered innovations that would later power industrial and technological growth. These developments also introduced new tools and methods for observing and measuring the physical world with unprecedented precision. Scientists began to rely more heavily on experimentation, quantification, and peer review, which formalized the process of scientific discovery and elevated its credibility. Astronomy likewise advanced with the use of more powerful telescopes and refined calculations, allowing for more accurate observations of celestial bodies and their motions. Discoveries about planetary orbits, star composition, and the scale of the universe stirred the imagination and deepened humanity's sense of wonder. Each revelation added complexity to our understanding of the cosmos and reinforced the idea that scientific inquiry was a constantly evolving journey. Yet alongside these discoveries came doubt not in science itself, but in the certainty of formerly held beliefs. The more science uncovered, the more questions it raised. This era marked a shift from accepting explanations based on tradition to seeking answers through investigation and evidence. Rather than weakening society, this intellectual tension energized it, encouraging debate, exploration, and a deeper pursuit of knowledge. The science explosion, led by minds like Darwin's, opened a path toward modernity built on reason, curiosity, and an enduring commitment to understanding the world in all its intricacy, crime and punishment. The origins of modern policing and prisons. The development of modern policing and prisons has its roots in a long and complex history of crime and punishment, particularly during the transformative period of the 18th and 19th centuries. Before organized police forces existed, communities often relied on informal methods of law enforcement, such as watchmen, constables, and local militias. These early systems were inconsistent and often ineffective, leading to a rise in public concern about crime, particularly in rapidly growing cities. As urban populations expanded due to industrialization, so too did incidents of theft, violence, and disorder, prompting calls for a more structured and professional response to maintain public safety and social order. One of the most significant milestones in the evolution of policing came in 1829, with the establishment of the Metropolitan Police Force in London by then Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel. This organisation introduced the concept of full-time, paid officers tasked with preventing crime and patrolling neighbourhoods, rather than merely reacting to incidents. These bobbies, as they came to be known, were guided by principles that emphasized restraint, public cooperation, and visible presence. Peel's model influenced law enforcement systems not only across Britain but also around the world, forming the foundation of modern policing strategies that prioritize prevention over punishment. During this same period, societal attitudes toward crime and justice began to shift. In earlier times, punishments were often public and brutal, including whipping, branding, and executions. These methods were intended not only to penalize offenders but also to serve as a deterrent to the wider population. However, by the 19th century, growing movements for reform and humanitarian concerns led to increased criticism of such spectacles. Philosophers and legal thinkers began to advocate for more rational and proportionate responses to crime, believing that justice should be fair, measured, and focused on rehabilitation rather than sheer retribution. The rise of prisons as a central component of the criminal justice system reflected these changing views. Rather than rely on corporal or capital punishment, reformers sought to establish institutions where offenders could be confined and corrected through structured routines, labor, and moral instruction. The prison was no longer seen as a temporary holding space before punishment, but as the punishment itself. Facilities were designed to instill discipline and order, often through strict schedules, silent reflection, and religious instruction. Solitary confinement was introduced with the belief that isolation would lead to repentance, although over time, its psychological effects came under scrutiny. Architectural designs of prisons also evolved to reflect new philosophies about control and surveillance. The panopticon model, proposed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham, featured a central observation tower, allowing guards to monitor inmates without the latter knowing whether they were being watched. This concept aimed to encourage self-regulation among prisoners and represented a shift towards psychological management of behavior. Though not widely adopted in its pure form, the principle influenced the layout and operation of many correctional facilities that followed. Meanwhile, the legal system itself underwent reform to support more consistent and equitable enforcement of laws. The codification of criminal statutes, establishment of formal courts, and training of legal professionals contributed to a more systematic approach to justice. This professionalization extended to policing as well, with officers receiving standardized training and working under established rules and supervision. Record keeping, forensic techniques, and investigative methods gradually became part of routine police work, making law enforcement more effective and accountable. The transition from arbitrary community-based punishments to state-controlled systems of policing and incarceration marked a fundamental transformation in how societies dealt with crime. These reforms were not simply about reducing lawlessness, but about redefining the relationship between the individual and the state. Authority was now centralized, and justice was expected to follow predictable, regulated procedures. While debates about crime, punishment, and public safety continue today, the origins of modern systems can be traced to this era of intense social change and legal innovation. It was a period when ideas about deterrence, rehabilitation, and fairness began to shape institutions that still influence contemporary law enforcement and penal policy. Spiritualism and superstition. The Victorian obsession with the paranormal. In the Victorian era, amid dramatic advancements in science, medicine, and industry, there emerged a parallel cultural fascination with the supernatural. While trains raced across the country and electricity lit up city streets, many Victorians turned their attention to the unseen world, hoping to understand forces that science had not yet explained. Spiritualism, a belief system centered on communication with the dead, rose to prominence and became more than a passing trend. It evolved into a full-fledged movement with deep, emotional, social, and philosophical impact. This obsession with the paranormal was fueled by grief, curiosity, and a longing to bridge the chasm between the material and the mystical. The idea that the living could speak with spirits offered solace in a time when death was common and often sudden. Epidemics, poor sanitation, and industrial accidents meant that mourning was a frequent experience. Spiritualism offered comfort by suggesting that the dead were not truly gone but waiting in another realm, ready to offer guidance and reassurance. Mediums became celebrities. hosting seances in dimly lit parlors and performing elaborate rituals that promised contact with those who had passed on. The experiences felt personal and transformative to participants, even as skeptics questioned the authenticity of the events. Photography, which emerged during the same century, added a new dimension to these beliefs. Spirit photographs claimed to capture ghostly presences alongside living subjects, often in family portraits. Though many of these images were later exposed as clever manipulations using double exposures and hidden props, they stirred imaginations and were accepted by some as genuine proof of an afterlife. These images circulated widely, often published in newspapers and albums, creating a powerful visual narrative around the paranormal and solidifying the belief that science and the supernatural could coexist. Superstition, deeply rooted in tradition, also maintained a strong hold over Victorian daily life. People believed in omens and signs that could predict misfortune or ensure protection. Horseshoes were nailed above doors, mirrors were covered after deaths, and touching wood was a common practice to avoid tempting fate. Folklore from rural areas mixed with emerging urban legends, creating a rich landscape of beliefs that shaped behavior and social norms. While scientific institutions flourished, many Victorians still placed faith in charms, dreams, and warnings from beyond. Notably, the fascination with the unknown did not exclude the educated or elite. Some of the era's most prominent minds, including respected scientists and authors, joined the quest to uncover paranormal truths. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882, attempted to investigate spiritualist claims using structured observation and empirical methods. Their goal was not to debunk but to understand, using scientific tools to explore what lay beyond the limits of human perception. Although their studies often uncovered fraud, the pursuit itself reflected the era's desire to merge rationality with wonder. Writers and artists played a crucial role in bringing the paranormal into mainstream culture. Gothic novels, ghost stories, and stage shows depicted hauntings, possessions, and eerie coincidences with gripping detail. Authors such as Wilkie Collins, Sheridan Le Fanu, and even Charles Dickens contributed to a literary genre that blended suspense with supernatural intrigue. The theatre adapted these stories into dramatic performances that thrilled audiences and mirrored real-life beliefs. Popular culture thus reinforced and expanded interest in spiritualism, making it fashionable as well as emotionally compelling. Even as advances in psychology and forensic science began to cast doubt on the credibility of spiritualist practices, the appetite for the mysterious did not vanish. Public demonstrations exposing fraudulent mediums made headlines, yet many still found meaning in the rituals and symbols associated with the spirit world. The legacy of this era lives on in the modern fascination with ghosts, haunted locations, and unexplained phenomena. The Victorians, navigating an age of progress and uncertainty, turned to spiritualism and superstition, not out of ignorance, but from a deep human need to find purpose, connection, and hope beyond the veil of the visible world. Fashion and the corset. How style dictated society and status. In the Victorian era, fashion was far more than personal taste. It was a visual language that communicated identity, morality, and social standing. Among the most iconic garments of the time was the corset, a tightly fitted undergarment that shaped the female body into an hourglass silhouette. This piece of clothing symbolized refinement, discipline, and adherence to social norms. Though often viewed today through a lens of restriction, The corset was central to how society defined beauty, gender roles, and respectability. Clothing choices were rarely casual or arbitrary. They reflected deeply held beliefs about class, virtue, and cultural expectations. The corset functioned not only as a fashion item but as a symbol of self-control and propriety. It molded the body according to ideals that emphasized a small waist and upright posture, qualities associated with elegance and femininity. Wearing one indicated a woman's willingness to conform to societal expectations, reinforcing her place within a structure that valued restraint and visible signs of order. The physical discomfort was often accepted as a small price to pay for achieving the desired look. As a result, the corset became a powerful emblem of the standards imposed on women, not only in appearance but in behavior. Upper-class women wore corsets as a mark of refinement, often custom-made from luxurious materials and tailored to accentuate their status. The tightness of the corset was a matter of pride and a public demonstration of wealth, since only those who did not engage in physical labor could afford to dress in such impractical garments. Meanwhile, working-class women often wore looser, more functional versions, still expected to follow fashion trends while meeting the demands of their labor-intensive lives. Even in variation, the corset acted as a cultural anchor across classes, uniting women in a shared visual code while subtly reinforcing divisions between them. Fashion during this period changed rapidly, with corset styles adapting to the shifting silhouettes of dresses. In the early 19th century, waists were higher and corsets relatively soft, but by mid-century, tighter lacing and rigid boning became the norm. The exaggeration of curves through bustles, crinolines, and hourglass shaping reflected evolving standards of allure and social grace. These styles emphasized the feminine form in ways that aligned with Victorian values, where external modesty paradoxically coexisted with internal bodily constraint. The silhouette created by the corset was seen not only as beautiful but as morally appropriate. Men's fashion, while less physically restrictive, also communicated status and decorum. Tailored suits, starched collars, and polished footwear denoted professionalism and respectability. However, it was women's clothing, particularly the corset, that bore the burden of expressing family honor and societal ideals. Daughters were raised to view corset wearing as a rite of passage, a transition into womanhood and social responsibility. Fashion magazines and etiquette guides further reinforced the idea that one's appearance was a reflection of character, making the corset both a garment and a moral statement. The influence of fashion extended into medicine and science, with debates about the health effects of corsetry becoming more common in the late 19th century. Critics argued that tight lacing caused organ damage, poor circulation, and fainting spells, while supporters maintained that proper corset wear encouraged good posture and support. Doctors and social reformers often used these arguments to either denounce or defend the practice, turning a garment into a topic of public discourse. These conversations reveal how clothing could transcend its physical form to become a battleground for cultural values. Despite criticism, the corset persisted because it served as a visual shorthand for dignity, order, and social aspiration. Advertising, fashion plates, and royal endorsements helped keep the image alive, perpetuating ideals that shaped generations of women's lives. Only in the early 20th century did fashion begin to shift toward more relaxed forms, influenced by changing roles of women, increased mobility, and evolving views on health. Yet the legacy of the corset remains, reminding us how fashion once carried immense weight in defining identity and status. Through fabric and form, society told its story, and in that story, the corset stood as both frame and symbol. Global trade and Victorian consumerism, foundations of the modern market. The Victorian era marked a significant turning point in the development of global trade and consumerism, laying the groundwork for the modern economic systems that define contemporary society. As Britain's industrial power surged, so too did its reach across continents, connecting producers and consumers in ways that had never been possible before. Advances in steam-powered transportation, such as railways and ocean-going vessels, drastically reduced the time and cost involved in moving goods, facilitating the creation of a global marketplace. This network linked raw materials from colonies to British factories and finished products back to markets around the world, creating an interdependent system that shaped both economies and cultures. Britain's Industrial Revolution generated a surplus of manufactured goods, including textiles, ceramics, and metalwares, which needed new markets to absorb the excess supply. At the same time, the empire's expanding colonial footprint provided a constant flow of raw materials such as cotton, tea, coffee, rubber, and spices. These items, previously rare and expensive, became more widely available, turning everyday homes into miniature exhibitions of global commerce. The British consumer, increasingly urban and middle class, embraced the variety and novelty offered by foreign imports. This expansion of choice marked a shift from purely functional purchases to those based on style, preference, and social meaning. Consumer goods began to carry symbolic value, serving as indicators of wealth, education, and cultural awareness. The ability to buy exotic items or fashionable products suggested refinement and access to global trends. The home became a stage for this performance of taste, filled with objects that reflected both personal identity and social aspiration. Decorative items from distant lands, polished furnishings, and branded goods all contributed to a carefully curated domestic environment that echoed the global reach of Victorian commerce. Shopping, once a necessity, evolved into a form of leisure and self-expression. Retail innovations responded to this shift in consumer behavior. Department stores emerged in urban centers, offering shoppers a new way to experience products. These establishments combined luxury, variety, and spectacle under one roof, attracting crowds and changing the rhythm of city life. At the same time, mail-order catalogues made it possible for those in rural or remote areas to access the same goods, democratizing consumption across geographic boundaries. This retail transformation brought together convenience, desire, and accessibility, creating a new relationship between buyer and product that transcended class and location. Advertising grew into a powerful tool for shaping public taste and driving demand. Printed posters, magazine spreads, and branded packaging appealed to the imagination, promising not just a product, but a better lifestyle. Companies began to associate their goods with values such as elegance, progress, and success. Marketing messages emphasized not only quality and utility, but also the emotional and social benefits of ownership. The consumer was no longer just fulfilling a need, they were participating in a broader cultural narrative shaped by commerce and imagination. Global trade, while enriching British markets, was closely tied to exploitative labor systems, particularly in colonial territories. Plantations and mines often depended on poor working conditions and limited rights for laborers, whose efforts fueled the prosperity enjoyed by foreign consumers. These realities were largely invisible to Victorian buyers, who encountered products only in their finished, appealing form. The separation between producer and consumer made it easier to ignore the human costs embedded in the supply chain. Nonetheless, this dynamic was integral to the operation of the global economy and its expansion. The spread of consumer goods introduced new cultural influences as British society engaged with foreign aesthetics and motifs. Eastern patterns, African carvings, and Asian textiles found their way into Victorian homes, reinterpreted through European tastes. While this reflected curiosity and admiration, it also reinforced imperial attitudes by placing exotic goods within a framework of ownership and display. The desire to possess the unfamiliar contributed to a material culture shaped by both fascination and control. By the close of the Victorian period, global trade and consumerism had reshaped how people lived, worked, and thought about their place in the world. The habits, systems, and values established during this time continue to influence markets today, revealing the lasting impact of a century defined by connection, consumption, and commerce, photography, and the birth of visual memory. In the early 19th century, the invention of photography marked a profound shift in how people captured and remembered their world. Before this innovation, memory was preserved through painting, written accounts, and oral storytelling methods that relied heavily on interpretation and were limited by time, skill, and access. Photography introduced a new possibility: to freeze a moment as it truly appeared, preserving the faces, places, and events of life with unprecedented accuracy. This technological breakthrough did more than document reality. It transformed the human relationship with memory, perception, and the passage of time. The earliest photographic processes were slow and complex, requiring long exposure times and chemical treatments. Despite their limitations, these early images were greeted with awe and excitement. Daguerreotypes, among the first commercial photographic formats, offered sharp and detailed portraits that quickly gained popularity. People who had never seen their own likeness could now possess an exact visual representation of themselves or their loved ones. This created a deeply emotional connection to the medium, making photography not only a technical feat but also a personal treasure. It gave permanence to fleeting expressions, enabling families to hold on to memories long after individuals had passed. Photography rapidly spread from private parlors to public spaces, documenting everything from city streets to rural landscapes. It allowed society to see itself in ways that had never been possible before. The visual record extended beyond the elite, capturing ordinary lives and environments with an honesty that painting seldom achieved. Through the lens, details once overlooked became central. The wrinkles in a worker's face, the condition of urban alleys, or the expression of a child at play. These frozen moments reflected a broader truth about human existence, offering insight and awareness to future generations. As photography became more accessible, its role in preserving historical events grew. War photography emerged as a powerful tool for showing the realities of conflict. Images from the Crimean War and later conflicts presented viewers with scenes of battlefield life and suffering that were difficult to ignore. These photographs did not merely illustrate, they shaped public opinion and deepened understanding. They revealed the stark contrast between romanticized notions of heroism and the actual experience of soldiers and civilians alike. By capturing these moments, photography became a silent witness to history, recording the emotional and physical toll of human endeavor. The family photograph album, a new concept at the time, became a cherished household object. Carefully assembled and often passed down through generations, These albums acted as curated collections of identity and memory. Each image told a story, whether of celebration, growth, or loss. Unlike paintings that required commissioning, photographs were more immediate and spontaneous. They marked birthdays, marriages, travels, and farewells with authenticity, providing a visual timeline of personal life. The ability to revisit these moments offered comfort and continuity, making photography a central part of how people remembered and connected. In addition to personal use, photography transformed the fields of science, anthropology, and journalism. Naturalists used cameras to document plant and animal life with precision, allowing for detailed study and classification. Explorers photographed distant lands and cultures, bringing images of the unfamiliar back to curious audiences at home. While some of these uses raised ethical concerns, particularly in the portrayal of colonized peoples, they also expanded the world's visual knowledge and challenged assumptions. Journalism found in photography a new way to report, providing readers with visual proof of stories that words alone could not fully convey. Over time, photographic techniques improved. Shorter exposure times, portable cameras, and eventually color processes expanded the possibilities of the medium. Photography moved from formal studio portraits to candid street scenes, capturing life as it unfolded. This evolution further blurred the lines between documentation and art, truth and interpretation. The photograph became not just a mirror to reality, but also a tool for shaping memory, emotion, and imagination. By allowing people to hold on to moments long after they had passed, photography redefined how individuals and societies remember. It turned memory into something tangible, transportable, and enduring. In doing so, it changed not only how people saw the world, but how they understood their place within it. Legacy of the Victorian Age. How its ideals still shape Western culture. The Victorian Age, spanning much of the 19th century, left an enduring imprint on Western culture, influencing ideals, institutions, and social values that still resonate today. During this period, the British Empire reached the height of its global power, and the domestic landscape was transformed by industrialization, urbanization, and reform. These shifts brought about a new social order defined by ambition, discipline, and moral conviction. The values that emerged, self-reliance, respectability, order, and progress, became the cornerstones of Victorian identity and have since shaped countless aspects of modern life, from education and law to family structure and public decorum. One of the most lasting contributions of the Victorian period was the emphasis on personal responsibility. The belief that individuals should strive to improve themselves through hard work and moral integrity became central to both personal and public life. This ideal encouraged perseverance and was often linked to social mobility, suggesting that anyone could rise through the ranks if they displayed the right character. Though modern society has diversified in many ways, the value placed on self-improvement and accountability remains a fundamental principle in Western cultural narratives, particularly in education and employment. Another influential legacy was the importance of family as a moral and social anchor. The Victorian home was portrayed as a haven of virtue, where each member had defined roles and duties. This structured model emphasized parental authority, the sanctity of marriage, and the nurturing of children as future citizens. Though modern families vary widely in form and dynamic, the Victorian idea of the household as a key social unit still underpins many legal and cultural assumptions about family life. it continues to influence debates on domestic responsibilities and social expectations. The period also saw the expansion of formal education, driven by the belief that literacy and discipline were essential to moral and civic development. Education was no longer reserved for the elite, but increasingly offered to the working and middle classes, supported by state intervention and public funding. The Victorian ideal that education serves both individual betterment and societal progress still informs modern school systems. Standardized testing, school uniforms, and a focus on punctuality and behavior reflect the era's influence on shaping orderly and productive citizens. Law and governance were also deeply impacted by Victorian ideals. The expansion of the civil service, police forces, and judicial reforms promoted order, transparency, and institutional trust. These structures were built on the notion that society functions best when guided by clear rules and moral codes. Today's public institutions continue to operate within frameworks designed in this era, emphasizing rule of law, bureaucratic efficiency, and civic duty. Even the concept of public service as a noble calling owes much to the Victorian ethos of duty and integrity. The arts and literature of the time provided another channel for expressing and reinforcing values. Novels, essays, and plays explored themes of morality, social justice, and human complexity, often with a didactic tone. Writers such as Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy addressed issues of poverty, gender, and class with emotional depth and social critique. Their works helped shape public opinion and inspired later movements toward reform. The Victorian view that literature should educate as well as entertain has endured, influencing educational curricula and cultural standards for generations. Public behavior and manners were codified in great detail during the Victorian era. Etiquette guides and social rituals emphasized politeness, restraint, and respectability. This careful attention to social conduct helped define class boundaries and shaped the way people interacted in both private and public life. While social codes have evolved, the legacy of decorum and self-regulation is still visible in professional settings, diplomatic norms, and everyday interactions where courtesy and control are expected. Even the architectural and urban planning ideals of the time continue to inform cityscapes. The emphasis on order, symmetry, and public service buildings reflected the Victorian belief in rational design and civic pride. Many parks, libraries, and institutions founded during this era remain in use, their structures symbolizing ideals of progress, learning, and accessibility. In countless ways, the spirit of the Victorian Age persists, its legacy woven into the foundations of modern Western thought, behavior, and public life.